I would love to get started tonight. So I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Marina Elliott. And as you all know, we are very excited about this talk. She's going to be talking to us about Homo naledi and the Rising Star Cave. I know those of you in my class, you will remember this because I made you all do an exercise on this. So it should be near and dear to your heart. Well, maybe close. But I'd like to introduce her first. So Dr. Marina Elliott, she's originally from Calgary. So you'll get a nice little Canadian twang in there like you guys get from me sometimes. So from Calgary up in Canada, she's a biological anthropologist. She's interested in the human journey and how and why and when humans became who we are today. She holds a PhD in biological anthropology and archaeology and has excavated ancient remains all over the place. So in Western Canada, in the US, in Spain, in Africa, and in Siberia. And she's also assisted with modern forensic excavations in Canada, which is where I became, where I met Marina. But anyway, I'll talk more about that in a second. So she's done forensic investigations in Canada, and in the US and in Switzerland. And she was a visiting scientist intern at the office of the New York Medical Examiners in New York City. So again, she has been to our state and I'm sure has some fond memories, hopefully. In 2013, she became one of 6 underground astronauts on the Rising Star expedition. And this expedition recovered thousands of fossils of Homo naledi, which we've talked about. And this, of course, is an entirely new species she'll tell you about of our early human relative. And this was from a cave deep underground in South Africa. And the discovery came, the discovery became one of the top science stories of the decade. And it's very exciting that she's here to talk to us about all this harrowing work in this cave. So from 2014 to 2019, Marina led further excavations at the Rising Star site and conducted research on Homo naledi and other early hominids. And she returned to Canada in 2020. We were discussing the COVID and implications on her life, like the rest of us, was quite dramatic. But Marina is now a researcher at Simon Fraser University, which is where I got my PhD and Dr. Rawlings got her PhD. So we have a little nepotism going on here. Anyway, and she continues to investigate our collective past. She's a fellow of the Explorers Club, which is in New York City. I actually have some friends in that I need to ask you about them. So anyway, and she was named the National Geographic Explorer in 2016. So we are thrilled to have her come talk to us today. I met Marina back in 2007 or 8, a while ago. And we won't go into that right now. So, so we had lots of good times at school and at the pub after class. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to let Marina Elliott talk to you tonight about Homo naledi. Thank you, Marina.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining me tonight. I know it's a little bit later there, so hopefully you have a glass of wine or beer or something to enjoy. And many of you obviously already know a little bit about Homo naledi and the Rising Star Cave, but a lot has happened since the original discovery. So tonight I just wanted to sort of walk you through how I got involved, a little bit about the discovery again, and then what we've learned since about this amazing new human relative. So first of all, a little background to orient you a little bit. There is an area in South Africa called the Cradle of Humankind. It's just outside of Johannesburg, and it's been famous for fossil hominin sites like Sterkfontein and Swartkrans for many, many years. Homo naledi's story started a little bit more recently in 2013 when 2 sport cavers, Rick Hunter and Steve Tucker, entered a cave system called Rising Star, located just on the edge of the cradle. The pair had actually been recruited by Lee Berger, an American anthropologist who's been working in South Africa for many years. And he's actually found another hominin species called Australopithecus sediba in 2008. And having found sediba, Lee was sure that there might be more fossils to be found underground. But as he jokes himself, he was no longer physiologically appropriate for caving. So he asked these guys to look out for bones on their recreational caving outings. Rising Star is actually a really well-known recreational cave, and hundreds of cavers have trained in its passages over the years, and it was been well mapped since the 80s. But one night, Rick and Steve were exploring an area off the map and ended up in a small slot in the rocks. They discovered that it actually continued down, 12 meters to be exact, and it led into a series of small chambers. In the second chamber, they found something quite interesting. These, whoops, there we go, these bones scattered on the floor, some of which looked very human-like. They took the photos to Lee to see if they were the kind of thing that he was looking for, and he immediately recognized them as something potentially important. But the cavers said that the route was really hard to get to, and Lee had to figure out how he was going to get the fossils out of the cave. So he did what any good researcher would do. He put an ad on Facebook. I didn't actually see this ad, but I was finishing a PhD in biological anthropology at Simon Fraser, and at the time, my supervisor sent me this ad. As you can see, the requirements were a little unusual with some pretty specific skills, and it sounded not only mysterious, but slightly crazy, so naturally I was in. And one of the reasons I was so keen was that I'd grown up in Alberta, hiking and climbing and caving for fun. So I'd figured I had the necessary physical skills to get into the cave, and I also had the academic skills from my degrees. But I also had excavated in some pretty unusual environments, first in Siberia with a 5,000-year-old mortuary site, and then in Alaska, where we excavated under armed guards, not for bad people, but for the polar bears. So I thought I had a pretty good package. Overall, almost 60 other people also thought that they had the right stuff for this job. In the end, though, 6 of us were chosen, 4 Americans, 1 Australian, and me. I like to call myself the Canada arm. Within a month, we were all in South Africa, setting up camp and getting ready to begin the work. The first task, of course, was to get back into that chamber where the bones were. And this was no easy task, and although the chamber is only 200 meters from the nearest surface entrance, it involves multiple crawls, squeezes, and climbs to get through the labyrinth of passages. And just because it's pretty hard to get a sort of sense of what it's like to go through the system, I hope you can see this video. This is actually Becca Peixoto and me working our way up that 12-meter high fissure called the chute. And there's an 18-centimeter pinch point in there that's really pretty tight to get through. And I've actually muted the sound because it's really just a series of huffing and grunting punctuated by some curse words. And this is the commute, part of the commute that we did every day, twice a day during the expedition. And I think I've done it something like 150 times now. As you can see, it was a little bit hard on the body. And just before I move on, those are not my hairy ankles in the right-hand corner. But we all really, I think, felt that these scratches and bruises were worth it because after just a couple of sessions, 2 expeditions, one 21 days and one 14 days, we had one of the single largest assemblages in Africa and one of the largest in the world. And this photograph here is only about 1/3 of the material that we recovered in 2013. So really, it was an incredible amount of material. And then, of course, finding all this material was just the beginning. The next task was to analyze all this material. In May 2014, I was fortunate enough to be able to return to South Africa to join the analysis and description teams. In total, there were almost 40 other scientists involved from all over the world, and we dedicated more than 10,000 man-hours to figuring out what we were dealing with. And that was also a little bit surprising. First, the preservation of the material is really unusual and pretty excellent. Unlike most of the sites in the cradle, the material in Rising Star isn't encased in hard breccia. It's actually in soft sediments, sort of much more like a traditional archaeological excavation. And the demographic profile is really interesting. In that first assemblage, we had 15 individuals, both males and females, ranging in age from neonates to older adults, and we now have something like 23 individuals just from the Dinaledi chamber. We also have some really complete elements, like this foot, one of 5 of which we have in the assemblage. And this beautiful hand that's entirely complete, only missing 1 small wrist bone. And when we found it, it was actually fully articulated with the fingertips sort of curved over the palm like that. And we have parts of 7 others in the assemblage. We have also recovered some extremely rare elements, like these tiny ear ossicles that were sifted out of the back dirt. Prior to Rising Star, only 2 such other bones existed in the hominin fossil record, and now we have 4. And because we have almost every element represented multiple times, we have a pretty good idea of what Homo naledi looks like. And overall, it shows a really interesting mixture of features. A brain about a third the size of a modern human, but with a rounded skull like other Homo, but internal morphology that suggests a more complex brain. It has small teeth like modern humans, but with some ancestral traits in shape. And its shoulders and upper arms are very ape-like, but the lower arms are more modern looking. And the hands, although the fingers are super curved, the wrists are really much more like modern humans. And the same sort of mosaic occurs throughout the whole body. And it's pretty small overall, averaging about 40 kilos or roughly 90 pounds and standing about 140 centimeters or just under 5 feet tall. And interestingly, some of Naledi's features appear to be entirely unique to it. In particular, the shape of the thumb and aspects of the spine and lower leg. So it seems as though Homo naledi might have been doing something different from other species in terms of its grip and its locomotor behavior. So I mean, that's pretty cool in itself. And because we have so many individuals represented so many times, we know that these features are not something related to a disease or a pathology or even an injury. And from the combination of features, we're pretty confident about designating a new species. And as if all of that wasn't enough, the physical context of the material is unusual. First, that vast majority of specimens that we collected in 2013 and 14 came out of a single excavation unit, 80 centimeters by 80 centimeters by only 20 centimeters deep. So that's about the size of a child's sandbox, and you can imagine the kind of concentration and density of material. Then, with the exception of a few modern bird bones and a handful of isolated rodent remains, there were no other large vertebrate species found in the chamber with all those hominin remains. Nor was there ever any evidence for fire or occupation at the site. And no evidence for carnivore or scavenging activity on the bones. The material also couldn't have fallen in from above because there's a capping layer of rock above the chamber that won't allow anything to fall in from above. We also know that the material wasn't washed in by something like a river or a flood. And this comes from the geological evidence in the sediments, as well as the presence of that beautifully articulated hand, because all those tiny bones would have been moved around or gotten lost had there been much movement in the sediments. We also know from the position of the bones that the material didn't enter the chamber all at once in some kind of catastrophe, but that they accumulated over time. So some sort of mass fatality event is pretty unlikely. So without any other options, we basically ran out of ways to explain how all these individuals ended up together in this remote area with no other species. And it left us with the only reasonable explanation that fit the evidence. And that was that Homo naledi had been deliberately disposing of its dead in the Dinaledi chamber. And that came as a bit of a shock, even to us, but it was the only explanation that made sense with the evidence that we had. But for me, a single instance of something is just a phenomenon. To be truly convincing, it helps to find another example. And in fact, we did just that by finding a second locality of Homo naledi remains in the Rising Star Cave. It's called the Lesedi Chamber, and it's separated from the Dinaledi Chamber by more than 140 meters of tunnels. And at the end of 2014, I moved to South Africa to work full-time on this location, and my first task was to excavate this material. The access actually to Lesedi is a little bit easier than the Dinaledi chamber, but if you can believe it, the working space is even smaller, with only room for one excavator at a time, and I mostly worked sort of hunched over on a pinnacle of rock with dolomite walls on either side of me. But again, I think we felt that the material we recovered was worth it because we ended up with 3 more individuals of Homo naledi, including this almost complete adult male, which we nicknamed Neo, which means gift in Sesotho. At the same time, we were working hard to date the material from the Dinaledi chamber to figure out where Homo naledi fit in the human timeline. The ancestral-looking anatomy had originally suggested to some researchers that Homo naledi might be 1 million or more years old, but after multiple analyses using double-blind labs, we actually found that the bones were surprisingly young. And in fact, just last month, my colleagues and I published a refinement of the dates, narrowing down the period in which the remains could have been deposited even further. So then our question became how to explain this mismatch between the anatomy and the dates. Well, we actually know from other examples in the animal kingdom that taxa can remain almost unchanged for millions of years, with modern populations looking very similar to their ancient ancestors. So it's possible that something like that was happening with Homo naledi. And in fact, we have other examples from the genus Homo, like Homo floresiensis from Indonesia, another small-bodied species with a strange combination of traits and a relatively young age. And in fact, also another recently announced species from the Philippines called Homo luzonensis also seems to show an archaic-looking species existing into relatively recent times. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of material attributed to luzonensis yet, so we'll have to wait for more evidence before we can say much more on that one. But collectively, these species are starting to show us a different pattern to human evolution than that straight line that it's sometimes visualized to be. And there might be a lot more nuance than we previously assumed. But Homo naledi's dates are also surprising because we know from other sites in Africa that anatomically modern humans were around at the same time and may even have been in the same area, which means it's conceivable that Homo naledi and modern humans could have interacted. Now, we can't say what those interactions might have looked like, but it's an intriguing set of questions, particularly since we already know from DNA that modern human groups share variable ancestry with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and at least 2 other potential ghost groups. So it is possible. Now, naturally, the recent dates also raise questions about the South African archaeological record. There isn't a ton of skeletal material associated with the Middle Stone Age in South Africa, so it's hard to say who made the stone tools that are found. And that, again, might be a little bit surprising, but it's not far off the situation in East Africa, where we already know there were multiple hominin species on the landscape at the same time, and no smoking gun to say which one of them was making the tools. And for me, these kind of discoveries make the science more interesting. And after all we've learned so far, there are still so many more questions about Homo naledi. One of the big ones, actually, for me, certainly, was whether or not that concentration and density of material that we found in 2013 was consistent across the chamber floor. And in fact, when we published the first descriptions, we kind of depicted the chamber floor like this consistent bone bed with fossils, the fossils that we collected just being kind of a subsample of that. Well, as it turns out, that wasn't actually quite right. In 2017-18, we went back into the Dinaledi chamber with the specific goal of determining the extent of the fossil material in the chamber floor. We actually decided to start below that 12-meter high chute where we thought the bodies might have been dropped or were entering, because it's sort of the highest point of the sediments in the chamber. So we figured if they were dumped or entered in that way, that we would find material directly below the chute and that we had found that it had trickled into the Dinaledi chamber proper. But what we actually found was a mass of skeletal material right at the top of the sediments, and another group of bones at the bottom of the slope, and almost nothing in between. And what was really cool about the material at the top of the slope was that some of it seemed to be articulated. That is, in the position it would be in life. And there were even some teeth peeking out at us from the surface. So this really made us stop and think about how best to get the material out, while also preserving the important position and orientation of the bones that we thought were articulated. In the end, we actually went old school and encased the material in plaster, the way paleontologists do to remove dinosaur bones. Unfortunately, the whole mass was too big to get up that narrow chute, so we had to divide it into 3 sections, which we affectionately called Blob 1, Blob 2, and Blob 3. Blobs 1 and 2 were pretty small, but Blob 3, which held what we thought was that really critical articulated material, was almost 2 feet long and weighed an uncomfortable 24 kilos, or almost 53 pounds. And by the time we actually wrapped it and protected it, and put it in a caving bag, we actually thought it might not get out of the chute at all. So that was a bit dodgy. But 6 cavers, 2 pulleys, and 2.5 hours later, we managed to get it out of the cave safely and back to the lab. But since they were so nicely protecting the material inside, we actually didn't want to open the plaster jackets right away. So instead, we CT scanned them to look at the contents inside, and you can see that on the right. Not surprisingly, Blob 3 turned out to be the most interesting one. Those tantalizing teeth that we'd seen on the surface actually turned out to be a whole set of teeth, most of which were in their proper position, and it appeared to be a juvenile, so that's really cool. And at the moment, the plan is actually to leave the blobs intact and virtually excavate the material inside with computer software, but that's going to take a bit more time. Then further into the Dinaledi chamber proper, we also opened up units on either side of the original 2013 excavation unit. And again, here we found a dead zone where around the original excavation unit where there were no fossils, and then another concentrated feature of bone. So instead of this consistent bone bed that we thought we had, we actually appear to have articulated material at the highest point in the chamber and at the lowest, but no evidence that the bones are tumbling from one area to the other or piling up against the rock walls in between. So this is actually super hard to explain as a natural phenomenon. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done to figure out what's going on. And that's about as far as we've managed to get at this point. So all of this is pretty interesting and sometimes challenging to fit in with what we know about the origins of humanity. But for me, it reinforces that we still have a lot to learn and that there's more going on in South Africa than we ever imagined. And that's really great. And it also proves that our family tree is a lot bushier than we thought. And in fact, might be better imagined as a river delta with kind of multiple streams flowing down from a common source, sometimes diverting and drying out, or sometimes joining other streams to finally make their way down to the big pool at the end. And of course, that big pool is the 7 billion of us today. And for me, this discovery also emphasizes that exploration isn't dead. I was totally one of those kids that loved reading about daring explorers and daring explorations, but I kind of thought that great age of exploration was over. But it's not. Homo naledi was discovered in a well-known cave in an area already famous for fossils. So there's no reason to think that there aren't more amazing things to find, some maybe even in our own backyards. And actually, on that note, now that I'm based back in North America, I've been thinking about what amazing discoveries we might have here. We think we know a lot about the prehistory of North America, but if Homo naledi has taught me anything, it's that there's always more to discover. So now, one of the things I'm working on is applying my experiences in South Africa to the North American fossil record and revisiting the evidence for human activity in caves on this continent, compiling what we know, what we don't know, and finding new ways to apply technology to the question of when and how humans came to dominate this part of the planet. And in the end, though, whether or not Homo naledi is a distant ancestor or a cousin, the research is relevant to all of us as humans. And that gives us an important opportunity to kind of reflect on what it means to be human, what we share as a species, and actually what we want our future to look like. And as a result, I hope that this research encourages everyone, whether you're a plumber or a president, to engage with human origins research and discovery, because it's all about our collective family history, and almost everybody's interested in that. And we actually have so much more to learn about our past, and I truly think it's an exciting time to be in the discipline and involved in the process. So I hope you will join me along the way. But now I'd like to open it up to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was so amazing. There were so many things that I actually didn't know. It's like
a lot has happened. Yeah,
I know. I was like, oh, geez, I didn't know you guys had a date. I was
yes,
totally with the, oh, I'm sure there's no date quite yet, but here we go.
and surprising dates. Yeah,
very surprising. Now I remember vaguely, and then I was just like, wait, is that real? Wow, that is so cool. I love that. And then of course, all the pictures of you in the cave is crazy.
Yes, we'll have this picture, then that won't be so crazy.
No, you go right ahead. Being claustrophobic myself, I was like, oh, geez, yeah, I'm glad you did that.
It's not for everyone.
It's not for everyone. If anyone has a question, you can either type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself and ask. Before I ask mine, oh, here's one question for you. So what did you end up using for dating? So how did you date it? What did you date?
Yep. We actually, as I said, ended up using 6 different methods, and that was, we tried OSL, we tried thermoluminescence, we actually did do radiocarbon just for kicks, even though we figured it would be beyond the scope of radiocarbon. In the end, most of the really accurate or sort of bracketing dates that we got were done directly on Homo naledi teeth. So that gives us, really direct dating evidence. And then we kind of took all the other methods and used them to bracket them. And the most recent paper was again on geology and sort of trying to constrain some of the speleothems in the cave to narrow down that time frame.
Wow. So you just tried to do as many things as possible.
Yeah, well, we just tried to, do
Yeah.
as many different techniques as possible, and then used double-blind labs for each, so that when we did have a date, that we could be as sure as possible. And I think we're pretty confident now, especially with this new refinement.
Right. Okay. Next question. Do you think that this cave is an early example of hominid funerals?
That's a great question. I tend not to use even the term burial when I refer to rising star, in part because it gives, most people have a mental image of a burial, and that's usually nicely, neatly laid out bodies. And we certainly don't have that either in the Dinaledi chamber or in the Lesedi chamber. And funeral practices, again, even in modern humans, historically, those vary so widely. I mean, everything from eating your ancestors in celebration of their life, to building, pyramids and mausolea and all that kind of stuff. So even in modern humans, the treatment of the dead runs a huge spectrum. So for me, it's not necessarily unheard of or unthinkable to imagine that Homo naledi was deliberately taking their dead into this space for a reason. I tend not to speculate about what that reason might be. I don't like to attribute motive to a species that isn't even my own. But it does certainly suggest a certain cognitive capacity beyond what, or at least further along the spectrum towards what we consider to be hominins or human behavior than what we've sort of assumed thus far.
Yeah, it's very challenging. Okay, so next question. Do you think they could have lived there?
Awesome question. We don't so far have any evidence of any kind of living, any sort of living activity in Rising Star itself. So no evidence of fire, no tools, none of that kind of stuff. We do have Swartkrans only 800 meters away from Rising Star, and Swartkrans has arguably some of the earliest evidence for the controlled use of fire at 1 million years. And so, there were hominins on the landscape both before this period and certainly long after. But we don't have any sort of habitation sites that we can actually attribute to Homo naledi at this stage.
Okay, so next question. How do you think Homo naledi navigated these caves, since they were even difficult for the archaeology teams to do?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, in the research that we've done so far, and we've done things like ground penetrating radar from the outside, and then extensive investigations internally in the cave system, we do think it's possible that there might have been an easier access to what's called the base of the dragon's back from the outside entrance. So the first maybe 130 meters might have changed in the past 300,000 or 400,000 years, that maybe made it easier for Homo naledi to get that far. But we do know that from basically the dragon's back up that terrible knife ridge and into the chute, the cave geology has not changed much in 300,000 years. And we know that in part from the sediments. The sediments inside the system are quite, inside the sort of subsystem of Dinaledi, are quite different from the outside. And so we're still up against this problem of, maybe it was easier to get to that point, but from the dragon's back down the chute, Homo naledi had to have been using either the chute or dropping bodies down. Now, they were smaller bodied than us. They were probably certainly more comfortable in dark areas. We know from baboons in South Africa, and I've been doing a little bit of research on that baboons in the area and elsewhere habitually use the dark zones of caves, not just even the twilight areas. They're going sometimes 200-300 meters into cave systems on a regular basis and not getting lost. And taking their infants in. They're doing all kinds of things in there, sleeping and other things one does in the dark. But we have footage of them doing this on a repeated basis, and they're not using fire. They're not, they're in some cases feeling their way through, or they're using scent or sound. They're calling to each other to move through the system. So I think, the sort of focus on fire or Homo naledi having to have had some sort of, light system is perhaps more a reflection of our dependence in the modern world on light than perhaps historic periods, because really it's only been in the last few hundred years that we've had consistent light at night. And even before that, controlled use of fire is one thing, but you don't have that all the time over big areas. So yeah,
Wow,
it's an interesting set of questions, though, for sure.
that's amazing. I had no idea about the baboons in the caves. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's really cool
Hmm,
stuff, actually.
that is amazing. Okay, the next question you basically already answered, but it's about the geography of the cave, different at the time of Homo naledi, and if there might have been an entrance that was in a different place. So you
Yeah.
already touched on that one. So I'll move on to the next question. When you went into the cave for the first time, how did you feel, and what were your first thoughts?
Oh, yes. Well, having been a caver before I even got this job, I was pretty used to stuffing myself places I shouldn't be. But despite that, the first time I looked into the chute, sort of down the chute, and saw this kind of, you know, jaws uh, set of shark's teeth all the way down, I did pause and think that perhaps I had bitten off more than I could chew. But just the idea of what was waiting on the other side of that overcame that fear. And it's still not an easy commute. Those pictures of the bruises and the scratches are an everyday thing. That's how we looked every day, all day. And I tried to remind both myself and my team that, this was not a normal commute, and that it is a dangerous space, and that it doesn't really take much. I mean, all it would have taken would have been a twisted ankle, or, something that incapacitated one of your limbs for it to be a really serious problem. And even Lee, when we were being told about this and applying for the job, he said, the plan B, if anyone gets injured inside the cave, is that we send the paramedics to you and you live underground until you can get yourself out. So that's the kind of environment that we're dealing with. But yeah, I mean, it was totally worth it. But yeah, I every once in a while, I'm still reminded that it's not a safe space.
Yeah. Wow. And kind of leading on from, well, different, but any career advice you have for folks who want to follow in your footsteps?
Oh, mercy. Well, as Jennifer might be able to tell you, I did not take a very linear path to where I am now. I actually graduated high school and had no interest in going into university. So I took myself traveling all over the world, which I think is a very, very good thing for people to do. It gives you a lot of perspective on humanity, and what we're capable of, both good and bad. And then actually I did a range of things. I got certified as a veterinary nurse, and I practiced in emergency critical care veterinary medicine for several years. And then I became a tour guide, and all through that time I was still rock climbing and caving and diving and doing all sorts of terrifying things as far as my mother was concerned. But it meant that I had a really sort of broad range of skills, so that when this opportunity came up, I was in a really good position to take it. So for me, probably my biggest piece of advice is don't sweat that you don't know exactly what you want to do just yet. Try out all kinds of different things, even within academia. Do some medieval archaeology, do some biological anthropology, do some cultural anthropology. That's sort of why 4 fields in anthropology is quite useful, because it's about a broad-based education. And then try all kinds of other things, because you never know when an opportunity as strange as something like this comes along, and then all of a sudden, what people thought when you were wasting your life in the years previously, all of a sudden comes together as making you the perfect candidate. So yeah, don't sweat it if you don't know what you're doing just yet. It'll all work out.
I absolutely agree. I came to everything late too, and did a million other things. So
Yeah.
it makes you who you are. It makes you kind of
Sure. And if
become
you're
the person you are.
totally committed and driven and you know exactly what you want to do, then more power to you. That's fantastic. But not all of us are so blessed.
No, very true. Do you plan on going back to the caves in South Africa?
I would love to. There are certainly, I mean, Rising Star is one of 16 sites in the cradle of humankind that have hominin remains. And that's the ones that are being, that are known and being worked currently. And there's, I'm sure, lots more to do. There's certainly a lot more to do in Rising Star. So one day, yes, I would love to get back in. And I actually really enjoy the excavation work. I like the dirty work. And there's not so many people that can do the stuff in Rising Star. So I hope I will get the opportunity to go back. But yeah, who knows? There are no guarantees in academia or in life. So yeah, I'll see what COVID has to say over the next couple of years, and yeah, hopefully I will get back into the caves, or I'll just stuff myself into caves in North America, and that'll have to do for now.
That pretty much answers the next question, was like in South Africa or anywhere else.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
They were like, when are you going back again? And we all want to be back in the field, but
absolutely, yeah.
Okay, any more questions? I don't have any more in the chat. If anyone would like to just jump in and raise your hand or put another question in the chat. If not, then that means I get to go to town. I mean, sorry. Alex, this is my colleague, Dr. Alex Smith, and you go right ahead, Alex. Ask away.
Great. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Awesome. So I'm thanks for that, Jen, but I'm going to ask a silly question.
You go right ahead.
The polar bears, that really struck to me. Like, normally you have to deal with, sheepdogs or something like that. What was that excavation with the polar bears? Did you encounter too? Ooh.
Yeah, so the excavation was a salvage operation of an Inupiaq burial site in northern Alaska, in Barrow. So it's basically as far north as you can get without falling off the continent. And it was at the request of the Inupiaq Council. So this material, as a result of climate change, was starting to erode into the Arctic Ocean. And so the team that I joined has been working up there for many, many years. And so I joined on as a research assistant. And yes, even though it was summer, the polar bears are prevalent and around on the pack ice. And so we had 2 local men on ATVs who would sit literally all day just scanning the ice for polar bears. And if the polar bears got too close, then we had to up tools and go sit in the vehicles for half an hour. And these guys were unbelievable. Perry, the one hunter, he would say, oh, there's a polar bear over there. And we'd all get up and look. And you're like, Perry, you're lying, And so then he'd get the like 600 power spotting scope out, and then you'd see this little speck on the ice, but he'd seen it with his bare eyes. And it was only a couple of times that the polar bears came close enough that we had to kind of move along. But even moving around town, you had to be, you had to be watchful because they were in town often.
Oh, that's incredible. That's unique. I've never heard that before in archaeology. That's great. So
yeah, well, somehow I'm specializing in extreme environments here, but yeah.
Yeah, extreme animals, extreme caves. Awesome.
Was that up at Ipiutak, like in the amazing site up there?
Yeah, it's right outside Barrow, and there's a local name for Barrow now, which I cannot pronounce. But yeah, there's a couple of sites all along the coast there.
Yeah.
But
it's
yeah,
amazing. Some of them had like the villages that were laid out, and
we were just doing these burials, and they're mostly bundle burials. So there's not always a ton of material in them, and a lot of it has obviously degraded terribly. But yeah, there's occasionally some fur, which is interesting because they were wrapped in seal hides and that kind of thing. And I mean, that research is ongoing. They've been at it for, I don't know, 15, 20 years up there. And it's,
What year was it when you were there?
Oh
I'm trying to
God.
remember.
Now you're
I
putting
know,
me
I'm
on the
trying to
spot.
remember. I'm like,
I think it was
there you go.
2003. Is that
Okay.
possible? My God, I'm old. Yeah, it's been a while.
Is there any more questions? You can either raise your hand or type it in the chat. Okay, Rosen, go right ahead. Oh,
Muted.
there you
Okay,
go.
sorry. You mentioned that the work you've conducted in South Africa inspired you to work within America. Have you found anything interesting yet, or something that you could share with us?
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's a fantastic question. So my idea, I mean, was pretty simple. You know, Homo naledi was found in a popular recreational cave in an area that's already well known. So what are we missing here in North America? And you know, there are lots of famous cave sites here. You know, in the Yukon, Bluefish Cave is a very important site for the peopling of the New World. And then, of course, in the U.S., there's tons of caves, Paisley Caves, all these places where there are really important sites. But there's that big gap in between in sort of Western Canada. And we have tons of caves. We have lots of recreational cavers who are in and out of these spaces all the time. And so one of my ideas was to start, you know, kind of recompiling this information and kind of saying, okay, what do we already know about these caves? Do we have a good map of where the caves are? What has already been found in these caves? What research has been done? And actually it's pretty interesting because although there's lots of recreational caves known, and there's probably, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so sites that have been worked, a lot of that research was done, you know, in the 70s and 80s. And we have a lot of new technology to throw at these sites now. You know, everything from ancient DNA to soil to, you know, proteomics and you know, even new visualization techniques for looking at things like rock art. So, and just re-examining museum collections, I think is a huge opportunity. So grad students, listen up. There are lots of opportunities. You know, there's lots of collections in museums that are just collecting dust that could use some fresh eyes, some new technology. So, you know, there's a lot of scope for opportunity, even if you're not sort of a field-based researcher. So get out there and start looking around.
So this is not my field at all. What is the oldest, I guess, Homo, I don't know, human remains that we have found within North America? I really don't know.
Yeah, well, see, there's the other thing. Oldest human remains is pretty young. I think that's about 11,000 for Anzac Boy. But for evidence of human activity, you know, arguably is Bluefish Cave at 24,000. And that's from supposed cut marks on bones. But again, that particular site is pretty contentious, in part because some of the original work didn't describe the provenience very well, didn't control their context super well. And so I don't know that a lot of people are that chuffed with that site at the moment, but it's certainly intriguing. And it's a site that I think, you know, merits some pretty close scrutiny. And then there's sort of a host of sites all the way down the Cordillera that, you know, suggest early dates. You know, now we have pre-Clovis, so we've got something before supposedly ice-free corridors opened up. That's when you get ideas about coastal migrations. But then you have these bizarre sites in Mexico and Central and South America at 14, 17, 18, possibly even as early as 33,000 years ago. So now we're presented with the problem of how do people make it all the way down, you know, an entire continent into South America in, you know, short periods of time that, you know, that the glacial maximums allow. But I think there's a lot of really interesting research that needs to be done on and is being done on that now.
Yeah, but so much potential for students, though, like you said, or for researchers as a whole, just within this continent. So that's really exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
I have another question. So how does it how does it feel to be known as one of the underground astronauts?
It's a little bit ridiculous, people. You know what? We caught a lot of flack for that underground astronaut thing, because of course everyone said, well, you know, an astronaut is by definition out in space. So how can you be an underground astronaut? And surely you should be a troglonaut or something. But troglonaut just doesn't flow very well, and nobody knows what a trog is most of the time anyway. So it was something that just got coined, in part, I think, because of the remoteness of where we were working, and the fact that the senior scientists were in this, you know, command center up on the surface, and all the communication was done, you know, via remote radios and television feeds and stuff. And they could see what we were doing, but we couldn't see them. We could only hear them. So there were a lot of parallels in terms of you know, the working environment being kind of remote and a little bit alien. And then there was the other kind of joke about the six of us having kind of the right stuff, this kind of peculiar range of skills and abilities that made us ideal for the job. And so, yeah, there were a few parallels, but yeah, we catch a lot of crap for it.
It's catchy. Come on.
It's catchy. I don't mind.
Catchy.
I really don't mind. Yeah.
I do like the analogy with like a command center. I didn't even think about that, but that's so true. Like,
Yeah.
You're totally removed from everyone else. And if you injure yourself, clearly you have to just get better on your own. So
yeah. And I mean, once we entered the mouth of the cave, the command center, you know, that's all they saw. You know, they just saw us kind of descending into the abyss. And then they had to wait till, you know, we got to certain checkpoints and got to the chamber before they could ensure that, you know, we were safe, and then, you know, the excavations could continue. So, you know, it's a lot like NASA command, you know, sitting on Earth waiting for the astronauts to come back to them.
No
So.
kidding. Could you go back to the slide that has you like just totally squatted in the middle of
the really uncomfortable part?
I know. I just looked at that and I was
That's-
like, wow, like
Yeah,
when I'm
that's
excavating,
Lassetti,
I
I
need
think.
space. So I just love that.
Here.
Any of those is pretty good.
I think
but
it's Lassetti. Let me find that one's the especially
the
enjoyable one. Yeah. So this you can
yes.
see on the top left there that I'm literally perched on a sharp piece of dolomite, and literally on either side of my shoulders is also dolomite, and I'm kind of T-Rexing it through the sediment there. And yeah, that's literally how I worked 6 to 8 hours a day. That's how much I spent underground. Yeah. So
did they provide massages after work with that?
I wish, you know. Yeah. And the one question that everybody wants to know and is always afraid to ask, except for the little people, whenever I do talks for children, I always get this question, but adults are usually too shy to ask. And the question is always, you know, what do you do about the bathroom? And we have a rule in caving that if you make it, you take it. So if you need to do something underground, you have to do it in a container that you can then take out of the cave. So I personally prefer not to do anything at all. So during my medical days as a veterinary nurse, I trained myself not to have to use the toilet for 12 hours. And so I don't.
Wow, that's skill.
Good
That
bladder
is skill.
control, people. Good bladder.
Yes. All my students know that I really go off on toilets all the time. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I love the toilet thing. Because
well, latrines are so important to your work. You know,
who doesn't want to know about a toilet? Come on.
Exactly.
Who doesn't want to know?
Yes.
So I have another one. And how has climate change created a need for salvage archaeology in Canada? And this is from Emily Russell, and she's from our anthropology club and our co-sponsors of this event. So,
you know, that is a fantastic question, and it's something that I think is really, really important. I mean, as much as we moan about climate change, and it is extremely destructive in some cases, it's opening up amazing opportunities in some research areas like archaeology and anthropology. So the Barrow salvage operation is one example, but retreating glaciers, certainly in the Rocky Mountains, is another example. And they're doing a lot of research under something called ice patch research. So in retreating glaciers, or in areas where ice is starting to shift and move around, you get opportunities like Otzi, the Iceman from Switzerland. We have Long Ago Man from Canada. We have a recent wolf pup that is 57,000 years old that was found in the Yukon, mummified, mind you. So, and that all of those examples are individuals that have literally melted out of glacial ice that are now being revealed for the first time to science. And that is wildly exciting. And one of the reasons I also thought that this cave project would be quite useful and interesting is that, again, with the changing landscape and the retreating glaciers, some caves that might have been accessible in the past, but had been ice covered in the recent past, might now be more accessible or again accessible to us. And of course, rock karstic systems are always changing. So a mouth of a cave that might have been open, when migrating first peoples came through, might have been closed for a while and now reopened as a result of ice melt. So there's all kinds of things that I think are really like opening up opportunities to do archaeology in some of these kind of liminal areas. But again, there's also, the erosion is so fast in the Arctic, and it's wreaking havoc not only on the people but on the landscape up there. And so I think we'll probably see more salvage operations, simply an effort to get the material up and out and get it analyzed before it disappears. And coastal archaeology is going to be a big thing, because more and more areas are going to be inundated. So if you're a diver, think about that.
That's what I originally wanted to do. I got my dive ticket and I was going to go do underwater archaeology. And then
me too.
somehow, did you? Okay.
Yeah.
So
and then
funny.
But there's hardly ever any bones in there, and I didn't want to just play with rocks.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, Alex, I see your hand up, but that might be from last time. So I'm going to just pretend it's from last time, unless you chime in and say
Or he
it's
has
not
another
from.
question.
Maybe he has another question. Alex has lots of questions. No, let's pretend it's from another time. I had one more while I'm waiting for him. Thumbs. So I did not know the whole thumb thing with their thumbs are that much different for Homo naledi.
The thumb morphology. Let me see if I can find that slide. Where did I do it in the before time? To find it in the before time.
Yeah, you had a whole bunch of thumb
there
bones.
There we go.
Yep.
So that line of thumb. Yeah, so it's the first bone here. So the metacarpal there, that is really weird. And obviously you can see we have multiple examples of it. So we know it's not pathological, and it manifests in every single one of the individuals that we have material for. And what it's showing us is that thumb muscle, those muscles surrounding the thumb, are extremely strong. So despite the fact that Homo naledi has these really curved, and I mean, curved fingers almost more so than any even extant primate, so really curved fingers. Despite that really curved finger morphology, Homo naledi still had a very precise, very strong precision grip. So obviously the leap is to tool using, that it was capable of tool use and tool manipulation. The other possibility is that it was doing something different with its hands in terms of its locomotion. So maybe not, could have been tree using or tree dwelling, and maybe the branches were smaller, so it was requiring a more precise grip rather than sort of an overhand grip that other primates use. Or perhaps it's a rock climbing adaptation. We have them in caves, so it is possible that there's something going on there. But whatever it is, whether it's tools or some locomotor adaptation, that particular the shape in the thumb, we don't see in any other hominin that we have evidence for. And there's some little details in the spine and lower limb as well that also seem to be unique to Homo naledi that we don't see in other hominins. And whether that means they're they're engaging in some sort of locomotor behavior that's slightly different. They're definitely bipedal, but whether they were doing something else that way as well remains to be seen. There's several papers now out on the thumb morphology. Kivel et al. They're pretty easy to find. Tracy Kivel is the hand lady, and she's done. There's I think 3 papers out on the hand morphology of naledi now, so you can look those up. But
have those
yeah,
been
cool
compared at all to non-human primates?
Yes, yep. All of that research was doing both non-human primates and or other early hominins.
I was like, well, if those baboons are hanging out in caves, maybe it's similar.
Yeah, and in fact, I worked with a student who was looking at finger curvature in cave-dwelling baboons. That stuff's not out yet, but yeah, it's really interesting potential, because I mean, certainly the cave-dwelling baboons might be a pretty close analog, and they're going up and down, 4 or 5 meter sheer drops. I mean, these are not walk-in caves. These are climb-in caves, and yeah, they're going in and out all the time.
Wow, that is amazing. Sorry, does anybody have any questions? Anyone else have a question? Now is your chance. Stick your hand up, type it in the chat.
Talk to me, I don't mind.
You can ask her about, let's see, toilets. You can ask her about polar bears.
You can ask me about forensics. You can ask me about...
Oh, forensics. Yeah. When were you in the New York City's, was it coroner's office?
Medical examiner's office. That was 2012. So, and if you can imagine, it was 2012 and they were still dealing with material from 9/11.
So with Amy's stuff, probably. Yeah. Oh, wow.
So yeah,
because one of our students actually went down, and she was in the New York City coroner's office for a few years, but after that she was with me in the field in 2011, and then I think she started down there in 2015 maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, New York is an interesting area to be in forensics in. Obviously, it's a busy little world. But yeah, it's very, very interesting. Also, I mean, for people in anthropology, forensics is again not for everyone. Lots of people, like lithics, they love their lithics. Lots of people like the bones, like that's fine. Not everybody is that keen to work with the soft squishy bits. And it gets pretty, pretty raunchy pretty quickly. But again, it's one of those things that for me at least, the academic interest of kind of solving these sometimes quite difficult puzzles, and then the importance to families and to loved ones, for people that you are assisting, is a big deal. And I try to remember that as well, that these people are people first and foremost. And so you are doing a service to someone else when you're looking at that kind of material. And it's a whole different thing from examining something that's not even your own species, as Homo naledi was. So it's a good reminder, just of the whole spectrum of what it means to be human, and how we need to be mindful of that. So
right, yeah, I couldn't do that. I like it no flesh.
Yeah, it's not always
old. Yeah, not always good. Does anybody else have any questions? Because I will I'll let, if anyone else has a question, let me know now. If not, I'm going to let everyone else go, but I'd like to chat with you for a few more minutes.
No worries.
Just a couple minutes. So if you don't have a question, feel free to. We thank you very much for all of your information tonight on several different topics. It was very informative, and thank you so much for talking to us. And
you're very welcome.
The Anthropology Club and the Anthropology Department, thanks you. We don't actually have any grad students. We're all undergrad. So
well, no, there's still time. You'll get there.
Yeah, so it's actually fun because you can inspire, undergrads, which I absolutely love. So thank you very much for your time. If anyone else would like to stay around and chat, briefly, then please do so. But the rest of you can feel free to go go have your food
To
and
go
your
away and
dinner,
have your
to
dinner.
go away and have your dinner.